1914 saw Thomas and Helen and their children Russell, Yolanda and Joy living in Timaru at 91 Victoria Street. Grumpy was still employed by the New Zealand Railways as a plate layer. Britain's declaration of war on Germany on the 4th of August 1914 confirmed the outbreak of the Great War, as it was known at the time. It is now more often referred to as the First World War or World War I. Conflict in Europe had been brewing for a number of decades, with a number of factors contributing to the war. The Prussian-led unification of Germany in the latter half of the 19th century led to the emergence of a large German state in the middle of Europe, altering the continent's geopolitical dynamics. In the Balkans, the Austro-Hungarian Empire faced problems with conflicting national groups that threatened Austrian control. Especially Serbia, who wanted to unite all Slavs in the region. An ambition that the Russian Empire supported, while Germany backed Austria. Great Britain, Germany and France were rivals in the economic exploitation of Africa. A number of incidents involving Germany and Africa aroused the suspicions of France and Britain. They were concerned that Germany was challenging the established colonial order. While in the Middle East, the crumbling Ottoman Empire added to tensions between Austria-Hungary, Russia and Serbia. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie in the Bosnian capital Sarajevo on 28th of June 1914 by Serbian national Gavrilo Princip was a defining moment. Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm II backed Austria to take whatever action it deemed appropriate. After issuing Serbia with a series of harsh ultimatums, Austria-Hungary declared war with Serbia on the 28th of July. On the 29th of July, Russia, in support of Serbia, mobilized against Austro-Hungary. Germany responded by threatening Russia with war. France reacted to the prospect of a Russo-German war by mobilizing its own forces. Germany declared war on Russia on the 1st of August and on France 2 days later. And when Germany invaded Belgium, Britain declared war on Germany on the 4th of August, and the First World War had begun. New Zealand received word of Britain's declaration of war on the 5th of August. New Zealanders regarded themselves as British, and Britain as home, so had little hesitation in supporting the mother country in its moment of crisis. The total population of New Zealand in 1914 was approximately 1.1 million, and almost 100,000 New Zealanders were to serve in the New Zealand Expeditionary Force overseas, in Samoa, Egypt, Turkey, Sinai, Palestine, Belgium and France. On the 29th of August, a 1,440 strong advance party, New Zealand Expeditionary Force, captured German Samoa, the second German territory after Togoland in Africa to fall to Allied forces during the war. The German strategy in 1914 was to concentrate on defeating France in 6 weeks, before moving them to the Eastern Front and doing the same to Russia. However, this plan was defeated at Marne in September by French and British forces, and the year ended with the two sides facing each other along the Western Front of France and Belgium. On 16th December 1914, the main body of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force left Wellington for Europe. Departing Wellington, the convoy headed across the Tasman to Hobart, then on to Albany in Western Australia to link up with troop ships carrying the Australian Imperial Force, the AIF. They then set out across the Indian Ocean, first to Colombo in present-day Sri Lanka, and then on to Aden in Yemen, and finally Egypt. After France and Britain declared war on the Ottoman Empire, it was decided en route that the New Zealand Expeditionary Force and the AIF were to be diverted to Egypt in defence of the Suez Canal. After disembarking the troop ships at Alexandria, they entrained to Cairo, where a camp had been established on the outskirts of the city at Zouton Camp. Here extensive training was carried out by the NZEF, along with time for the New Zealanders to play tourist in an environment completely foreign to home. Later in December 1914, the New Zealand Expeditionary Force combines with the Australian Imperial Force units to form the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, or ANZAC. Meanwhile, back in New Zealand at the start of 1915, Thomas and family were still living in Timaru, at 91 Victoria Street. 3rd of February 1915 sees New Zealand's first combat of the war, when they helped defend the Suez Canal against an attack from German-led Ottoman forces. The New Zealand Expeditionary Force's wait in Egypt ended in early April 1915, when it was transported to the Greek island of Lemnos to prepare for the invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula. The peninsula was important because it guarded the entrance to the Dardanelles Strait, a strategic waterway leading to the Sea of Marmara and, via the Bosphorus, the Black Sea. The Allied plan was to break through the straits, capture the Ottoman or Turkish capital Constantinople, and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The straits were guarded by a series of heavily fortified Ottoman positions. This included a vast curtain of sea mines. Following the disaster and failure of the British and French warships to force the straits, the Allies dispatched the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force to capture the Gallipoli Peninsula. New Zealanders and Australians made up almost half the total strength of the force of 75,000. The rest were made up of troops from Great Britain, Ireland, India, France and Newfoundland. A truly international force. Shortly before dawn on the 25th of April, the 1st Brigades of the Anzac Corps began landing at Gallipoli. However, the landing went awry and the Corps were landed 1.5 miles further north, in a shallow, nameless cove, later known as Anzac. The cove consisted of an 800-metre strip of beach, overlooked by a warren of ridges and gullies, which offered the few Turkish defenders an ideal defensive position. New Zealanders followed the Australians in, and took up positions in the northern sector of Anzac. The landings never came close to achieving their goals. Although the Allies managed to secure footholds on the peninsula, the fighting quickly degenerated into trench warfare, with the Anzacs holding a tenuous perimeter against strong Turkish attacks. Early in May 1915, the New Zealand Infantry Brigade was ferried south to Cape Helles, where it took part in an assault on the village of Crethia. The following is an excerpt from an account of the battle by Bill Ledley of the Canterbury Battalion, as they crossed the notorious Daisy Patch.
Our turn to go across came next, and we went over the top in good order with the best of luck. At once we were greeted with a terrible fusillade of rifle and machine gun fire, which was deadly. The man on my right had his brain shot out into his face, and the chap on my left was shot through the stomach. Halfway across the patch, I tripped over a root and fell down. I lay still for 2 or 3 minutes until I had recovered my breath. Then the bullets started plugging up the earth around me, and so I got up again and made for the Turkish trench as fast as I could go.
The attack was a complete disaster. The New Zealanders suffered more than 800 casualties, but achieved nothing and resulted in a stalemate on the peninsula. In August 1915, the Allies launched a major offensive in an attempt to break the deadlock. The plan consisted of the Australians and New Zealanders capturing the high ground overlooking the Anzac sector, the Sarri Bear Range, while a British force landed further north at Suvla Bay.
Move! Go!
At 5 p.m. on 6th of August, whistles signalled the beginning of the assault, with the Australian 1st Brigade attacking the heavily fortified Turkish positions around Lone Pine. The Australians finally secured the enemy trenches after 3 days of intensive and at times savage hand-to-hand combat. 2,277 Australians out of a total of 4,600 were killed or wounded during the course of the battle. Meanwhile, early on the 7th of August, under the cover of darkness, the 4 understrength regiments of the New Zealand Mounted Rifles were trusted with clearing out the chain of Ottoman outposts that ran along Rhododendron Spur up to the summit of Chunuk Bair. While these attacks were successful, the plan was running about 2 hours behind schedule, making it difficult to reach the summit before first light. The New Zealanders' attack on Chunuk Bair was to coincide with an assault on Baby 700 at the Neck by 2 regiments of the Australian 3rd Light Horse Brigade. A narrow saddle, the Neck connected the Australian and New Zealand trenches on Walker's Ridge at a plateau designated as Russell's Top, to the knoll called Baby 700. The Neck was between 30 and 50 metres wide and sloped off to steep valleys. From 4:30 a.m. on the 7th of August, the Australians mounted a futile bayonet attack in 4 waves of 150 men against heavily entrenched and equipped Turks.
Go!
Due to poor coordination and inflexible decision-making, they suffered heavy casualties for no gain. Of the 600 Australian troops involved, 234 were killed and 138 wounded. A complete, devastating failure. In the meantime, with the delay, the opportunity for a swift victory at Chunuk Bair had been lost. With the failure of the attack at the neck and the realization that Chunuk Bair was in danger of being overrun, the Ottomans reinforced the peak. The force tasked with taking the summit of Chunuk Bair was the New Zealand Infantry Brigade. In daylight, after an exhausting climb and faced by stiffening opposition, the prospects of a New Zealand assault looked slim. At 11 a.m, the Auckland Battalion were ordered to attack, making it as far as the Pinnacle. About 300 casualties fell between there and the apex. The Wellington Battalion were then ordered to continue the attack. However, their commander, Lieutenant Colonel William Malone, refused.
I am not wasting the lives of my men. We will take the peak at night.
A naval bombardment of the peak began at 3:30 a.m. The Wellingtons, followed by the 7th Battalion of the Gloucestershire Regiment, reached Chunuk Bair virtually unopposed. The preceding barrage had driven most of the Ottoman defenders away, as the ground was too hard and rocky for deep entrenchment. Chunuk Bair was hard to defend, as it was only possible to scrape shallow trenches amongst the rocks. It was also exposed to fire from the main Ottoman trench on Battleship Hill. By 5 a.m. on the 8th of August, the Ottomans counterattacked, with the New Zealanders desperately holding off the enemy with close hand-to-hand fighting. This continued for much of the day. Around 5 p.m, Lieutenant Colonel Malone was killed by a misdirected artillery shell. As darkness fell, the fighting subsided, and the Wellingtons were relieved from their position. Of the 760 men of the battalion to reach the summit, 711 had become casualties, either killed or wounded. For the wounded, the suffering was only the beginning. Some took 3 days to travel from the higher reaches of Rhododendron Spur to the beach, a little over a kilometre away. Chunuk Bair was the limit of the Allied advance. A Turkish counterattack on the 10th of August forced the troops who had relieved the New Zealanders off Chunuk Bair, while the British failed to make any progress inland at Suvla. The failure of the August battles and the September attack on Hill 60 meant a return to stalemate. In mid-September 1915, the exhausted New Zealand infantry and mounted rifles were briefly withdrawn to Lemnos to rest and receive reinforcements from Egypt. By the time the New Zealanders returned to Anzac in November, the future of the campaign had been determined. On the 22nd of November, the British decided to evacuate the battlefield, and this began on the 15th of December, with 36,000 troops withdrawn over the following 5 nights from Anzac. Gallipoli was a costly failure for the Allies. 44,000 soldiers dead, including 8,700 Australians and 2,779 New Zealanders. The reason behind Thomas enlisting in the New Zealand Expeditionary Force may never be known. Initially, I found it incredible that a man 37 years old would volunteer. However, upon further research, this was not uncommon. and there were many cases of middle-aged men volunteering. There is a brief mention of Thomas's service in both the South African War and World War I in the McLay family tree, 1979, compiled by Rudy McLay, stating that Thomas's enlistment in 1915 was very much against his wife's and parents' wishes. In my opinion, Thomas, like many New Zealand men, had a sense of duty and wanted adventure. I also believe that his brief involvement in the South African War 13 years earlier had possibly left him unfulfilled in this regard. However, this is only an assumption and can never really be confirmed. Thomas's induction in the New Zealand Expeditionary Force began with him completing and passing a medical assessment on the 28th of October 1915 in Timaru. It is possible that he is in this photo, but given the quality of the photo, it can't be determined. From there he was ordered to report to the Trentham camp in the Hutt Valley near Wellington, where he was enlisted on the 16th of November 1915. 6/4109 Private Thomas Benjamin McLay, 10th Reinforcements Canterbury Infantry Battalion, C Company. Commenced his training at Trentham, 18th of November 1915. Trentham Military Camp near Upper Hutt was opened in October 1914. It was the Defence Department's first training camp. The earliest recruits lived there in tents, but wooden huts and other buildings were erected in 1915. During World War I, over 30,000 New Zealand soldiers marched between military camps at Trentham and Featherston in the Wairarapa via the Rumataka Hill Road, in a 3-day trek of 27 miles. There were 23 marches of 500 to 1,800 men between September 1915 and April 1918, at the end of their training as reinforcements for the New Zealand Expeditionary Force. Thomas's training at Trentham also included inoculations for typhoid on the 28th of November and 8th of December 1915. There is no documented evidence, however, recording any leave that would enable him to spend time with his family before being posted overseas. Leave may well have been granted. His training lasted 3.5 months. It appears on Thomas's military records that his next of kin was Mrs. T.B. McLay, Helen. It also states that she and the children had moved back to Waikouaiti, possibly to stay with Thomas's family. With his basic training completed at Trentham on the March 3rd, 1916, Thomas boarded the Willocra in Wellington, and along with the other 10th Reinforcements embarked for Egypt on the 4th of March. The route taken to Egypt was a similar one as taken by the main body in 1914, with the exception of the stop in Hobart, Tasmania. On the 10th of April 1916, the Willocra arrived at Suez, Egypt, where Thomas disembarked and then entrained to Port Said. The distance by train was approximately 145 kilometres. The first New Zealand troop ships began leaving Egypt for France from early April 1916. Thomas embarked for France aboard the Kenfon Castle on April the 13th. The route through the Mediterranean via the island of Malta took a little over a week, with Thomas arriving in Marseille in France on April the 21st. The New Zealand troops received a very warm welcome once they had arrived in France. Upon arrival in France, Thomas and the New Zealanders boarded a series of trains for the 3-day journey north to Étaples-sur-Mer in northern France. At the start of the war, the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, or NZEF, had a single infantry brigade of some 4,000 men. New Zealand's 4 military districts each contributed a quarter of the men for this brigade, which comprised Auckland, Wellington, Canterbury and Otago battalions of around 1,000 men each. A second infantry brigade, the New Zealand Rifle Brigade, was established in 1915 during the Gallipoli campaign. Unlike the original brigade, the Rifle Brigade drew recruits from across the country, so it numbered its battalions rather than named them after specific regions. The New Zealand forces were reorganised in Egypt in early 1916, when a full New Zealand division was formed. The original infantry brigade was renamed 1st New Zealand Infantry Brigade, and a 2nd New Zealand Infantry Brigade was created. The 2nd Brigade's structure mirrored that of the 1st, with 4 regional battalions of 1,000 men apiece. The battalion's order of seniority was Auckland, Canterbury, Otago and Wellington. The New Zealand Rifle Brigade was renamed the 3rd New Zealand Rifle Brigade, and the New Zealand infantry now numbered more than 12,000 men. After arriving in Europe, the New Zealand division was transferred to the northern section of the Western Front, where the British Expeditionary Force was concentrated. In April 1916, the division set up camp around the French town of Hagenbroek on the Flanders Plain, a low-lying region of northern France and western Belgium. Here the troops were instructed on the trench warfare techniques that the British Expeditionary Force had developed during the previous 18 months of fighting. The training helped prepare the division for deployment east of Armentieres, where it arrived from May 13, 1916. On the 18th of May 1916, Private Thomas Benjamin McLay, after completing initial training, joined the 2nd Canterbury Battalion as part of the 2nd New Zealand Infantry Brigade. We will tend to focus on the 2nd Canterbury Battalion's movements as we proceed forward, as it must be assumed that Thomas would have been stationed with them, unless otherwise mentioned in his army records. In mid-1916, the Western Front around Armentieres was seen as a quiet or nursery sector, with less intense fighting than in areas such as the Ypres salient to the north. The New Zealand soldiers' experience in Armentieres was dominated by the tedium of trench warfare, training, work parties and trudging along the network of communication trenches. Thanks to a complicated system of scheduled rotations, a soldier typically spent only a few days each month in a frontline trench. A support line 180 metres behind the front line was backed up by another 540 metres back. The 3 lines were linked by a maze of communication trenches, which allowed men to move between them under cover. As the New Zealanders grew accustomed to their surroundings, they began sending out patrols into no man's land and launched a series of aggressive trench raids against the German lines in their sector. During 3 months at Armentieres, the New Zealand division made 11 trench raids and was the target of 4. Some were successful and some failed, such as the 1st Otago Battalion's raid on the 13th of July. The Germans ambushed the Otago men as they crossed no man's land. Devastating artillery and machine gun fire killed or wounded 163 of the 181-man raiding party. The Battle of the Somme commenced in the early hours of July 1, 1916. The battle consisted of 3 major offences until November the 18th. 3 million men fought in the battle, with 1 million wounded or killed. On the first day alone, the British suffered 57,470 casualties, including 19,240 men killed, the most in the history of the British Army. New Zealand's involvement in the Battle of the Somme would not be until the third phase, in September. Back in New Zealand, the conscription bill was passed on August 1, 1916. This empowered the government to call up any man aged between 20 and 45 for military service at home or abroad, and this was subject to a medical examination and a limited appeals process. Meanwhile, the New Zealand Division was still deployed in the Armentieres sector. Thomas and the 2nd Canterbury Battalion were relieved on the night of the 9th of August by the 2nd Auckland Battalion and moved to the subsidiary line. On the 15th of August, both Canterbury battalions were relieved by the Gordon Highlanders and moved to billets in Armentieres. Billets were temporary lodgings for soldiers who were stationed behind the front lines. The troops were accommodated in a range of civilian buildings that had been acquired for military use. In mid-August, the New Zealand Division began the 120-kilometre journey south of Armentieres to the Somme. It would take approximately 3 weeks to reach their base of operations on the battlefield. Marching out with their respective brigades on the 16th of August, the 2 Canterbury battalions entrained at Stanwijk and left the train at Eblain-Orlay. The 2nd Battalion marched to billets in Blaye. Then on the 21st of August, the New Zealand Division entrained to Arches, and then south, with Thomas and the 2nd Canterbury Battalion detraining to Punrami, and then marching to Al Arji. On the 2nd of September, they marched out of Al Arji, passed through Erin, and were billeted for the night in La Meige. Moving on next morning, they reached Pichene, on the opposite bank of the Somme, from La Chaussée, and remained there for 3 days. The time was spent training and a brigade attack practiced. The 2nd Canterbury Battalion and Thomas resumed their march on the 7th of September and spent the night at billets at Cardonnet. The next day they marched via the Amiens-Albert road to a camp south of the road and west of Denancourt, where they remained until the 10th of September. On the night of 8th of September 1916, the New Zealand Division was placed under the command of 15 Corps of the British Fourth Army. The battle had been raging for 2.5 months by the time the New Zealanders arrived on the Somme, and the enemy's defences had been penetrated to a maximum depth of 4 miles on a front of around 20 miles. On the 12th of September, the 2nd Canterbury Battalion, 700 strong, was with the 2nd Wellington Battalion in Brigade Reserve, bivouacked in Savoy and the Carlton trenches, midway between Longueval and Bazentin-le-Grand. On the 13th and 14th of September, the reserve battalions completed the new front line, Otago Trench, and dug communications trenches to it. It is uncertain when Thomas would have become sick. However, it is noted as to hospital sick on the 15th of September 1916 on his records, the same day as the New Zealand Division's initial involvement in the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. Thomas would have been assessed at an aid station or field hospital, which would have resulted in him being evacuated and transferred to No. 1 NZSH, or New Zealand Stationary Hospital, in Amiens, 25 kilometres from the front. The opening attack of the third phase of the Somme battle took place on September the 15th. On the right of the British, the French had attacked on the 13th. On the British front, the whole 4th Army attacked along with the 1st Canadian Corps, this having been preceded by 3 days' continuous bombardment. The New Zealand infantry assault began at 6:20 am on the 15th of September. Their immediate goal was the German Switch Trench, about 400 metres away. Once 2nd Brigade secured this line, 3rd Brigade's 4 battalions leapfrogged through to seize the portion of the German Flers trench system that lay in the New Zealand sector, just to the left of the village of Flers. They also helped secure Flers, which had been taken earlier by the neighbouring British division. On the evening of the 15th September, the 1st Canterbury Battalion was ordered to relieve the Auckland and Otago battalions in the newly won Switch Trench. Meanwhile, on the 17th of September, Thomas was admitted to hospital with diarrhoea at No. 1 NZSH at Amiens. All fresh troops were subject to attacks of diarrhoea, and large numbers of the more serious cases were hospitalised for dysentery. It was also noted that New Zealand troops in general were prone to dysenteric infection and suffered more attacks than did other British Empire troops. The conditions of trench warfare in France were such that it made it extremely difficult to maintain an efficient standard of sanitation. On the Somme in 1916, there was an outbreak of dysentery. There were 81 deaths from dysentery in the New Zealand Expeditionary Force overseas. Back on the front on the 20th of September, selected companies of the 2nd Canterbury Battalion assaulted the German-occupied Flers line and junction of Goose Alley. The objective was achieved under withering machine gun fire, sustaining heavy casualties. An enemy counterattack later on the 20th of September resulted in some of the gains being lost, but was ultimately repulsed and the position secured. The 2nd of September saw the 2nd Canterbury Battalion relieved by the 1st Battalion Munster Fusiliers and went back to trenches north of the Longueval-Bazentin-La Grande Road, with headquarters at Thistle Dump. The first ever tanks used in combat were unleashed onto the battlefield during the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. Although their initial effectiveness is debatable and designs were primitive, the face of modern warfare was changed forever. Thomas was discharged from hospital on the 23rd of September and rejoined the 2nd Canterbury Battalion on the 27th of September at Thistle Dump. On the 29th of September, orders were issued to the 2nd Canterbury Battalion, with objectives to take and secure the deep depression at the junction of Goose Alley and Grid Trench, and the strong positions on the high ground to the north and west of the hollow. 2 days later, Thomas and the 2nd Canterbury Battalion advanced under a creeping barrage, charging the trenches and engaging the enemy, with support from the 2nd Otago and 2nd Wellington battalions. The morning of the 2nd October found the companies of the 2nd Canterbury Battalion mixed up, and reorganisation was ordered. No enemy counterattacks were made during the day. Owing to the heavy state of the ground, the relieving battalion were 9 hours late, and the 2nd Canterburys were not relieved till the morning of the 4th of October. must be assumed that this was Thomas's first real combat action of World War I. One can only imagine the horrors he must have witnessed. The 2nd Canterbury Battalion, on relief, moved back to Fricourt. Here the battalion spent 2 days resting and re-equipping itself. Its losses in the last attack were severe, with 33 killed and 140 wounded or missing. This was the last attack in the battle in which the New Zealand Infantry Division took part. The 2nd Canterbury Battalion had lost more heavily than any other battalion in the division, 125 killed and 621 wounded or missing. The New Zealand Expeditionary Force altered their uniforms and equipment as the war developed. After the Gallipoli campaign, they replaced the Territorial Force uniform with khaki uniforms of British style, together with the distinctive campaign hat that would come to be nicknamed the Lemon Squeezer. The different branches of the service were distinguished by coloured puggaree or wide bands around the base of the crown. Thomas would have worn a khaki and red one for the infantry, similar to this image. The uniforms of the Western Front included a greatcoat, the Brodie helmet when in combat, and the universal combat boots and puttees wrapped around the legs. In their pack, soldiers carried a mess kit, toiletries, sewing kit, extra socks and long johns, tent pieces, emergency rations, and an entrenching tool, such as a spade. The firearm carried by the New Zealand infantry regiments was generally the Lee Enfield Rifle No. 1 Mark III. This was able to be fitted with a bayonet.
You've
18,000 members of the New Zealand Division went into action on the Somme. Nearly 6,000 men were wounded and more than 2,100 lost their lives. Over half New Zealand's Somme dead have no known grave. Their names are on the New Zealand Memorial to the Missing in Caterpillar Valley Cemetery near Longueval. New Zealand brought one of these men home in November 2004. His remains lie in the tomb of the unknown warrior in the forecourt of the National War Memorial in Wellington. From early October 1916, Thomas and the 2nd Canterbury Battalion, along with the majority of the New Zealand Division, make the return journey to the Armentieres sector. The 2nd Canterburies were soon placed on rotational duty in and out of the front line, and with the horrific toll of the Somme fresh in their minds, they wondered if this nightmare could be exceeded. Those fears were soon realised with the coming of a new year, 1917.
come the